Hi, everybody. Good morning. There you are. How are you? It's good to be with you. Okay, so we are gonna do second wave feminism today. It's a lot. So normally your core readings for today are two, Simone de Beauvoir, and Betty Friedan. And this is really, these two women become the core of second wave feminist theory, and you're going to learn all about housewife fatigue, which is going to sound really familiar from first wave feminisms, hysteria and rest cure. So you're going to sort of see the shift from first wave to second wave. The thing is, as you know, I'm also a historian and teach in the history department. And so second wave feminism for me is not just as simple as de Beauvoir and Friedan, which is normally where it begins and ends. For me, there's way more precedent and there's way more history that keeps going into the 70s for me with second wave. So I'm going to break this down into 4 parts. I have lots of images. I'm going to do this through images. And I think I was telling you guys in an earlier video that my PhD is in American Studies, so that it's just an interdisciplinary degree. So I do most of my work through history, literature, art, images, media analysis. So it's this really interdisciplinary degree. So that's often how I teach. So if you're like, we're all over the place. Yeah, we are. That's what we're doing. Okay, so if you can, take out notebooks and a pen, get out your laptop, bring up a blank Word document. Second wave feminism, here we go. So remember, just a little recap of first wave feminism, that first wave begins in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention. It's all the old sort of white queens of feminism, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a great start. It was just lacking a lot, right? There wasn't a lot of inclusion. There wasn't a lot of like class consciousness, any of that. And that's, that's where they were at. No judgment, but like a little bit of judgment, right? So what happens is that it ends when the 19th Amendment gets ratified. The 19th Amendment, of course, says that the vote cannot be hindered based upon sex. And remember, race was earlier. That was this, all during the 1861 to 1865. It's the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments to end enslavement, to end race prejudice in voting. But of course, it didn't, right? There was a lot of pushback to that in the Klan and all sorts of stuff. Gender gets passed in 1920. So there's no barriers to voting for based along gender lines. Women can vote, is in plain English. The thing is that that's all great and good. Why did it take so long, right? Why did it take so long? Well, 2 things. One is that we had the Civil War, so our shift is not, like we weren't thinking intersectionally at this time. Sojourner Truth was solely thinking intersectionally, right? Or all Black women probably were. But as a country, we were focused either really on race or gender. And so when the Civil War started happening and it was these questions of enslavement and what to do with states' rights and federal rights and all this stuff, gender got just forgotten about, literally forgotten about for 50 years. Then remember too that we had World War I. So World War I was 1914 to 1917 or 1919, depending on which country you are. And it was just done, right? Like we were in a world war. It was totally overwhelming and all consuming. And gender, again, was just forgotten about. It was not seen as germane, as center, as core, as foundation, as necessary. So when the war ends, when World War I ends in 1919, 19th Amendment is finally like, women are like, listen, we went on the back burner for like decades and decades and decades. Enough. Pass this freaking amendment. And they did. The government did. 1920, 19th Amendment was ratified. Here's the thing. the 20s were rad, right? For a lot of people in a lot of ways. Some obviously more than others, like white women are becoming the new woman. That's a phrase. They're flappers. They're having a great time. They're wearing pants. They're smoking cigarettes. They're allowed in public. Like the 20s are pretty rad for white women, especially of some wealth. The 1920s also, though, were the beginnings of the Great Northern Migration for African Americans, because the South is just a dead end for employment, rights, life, right? It's leading into the 1930s, the late 20s, and the Harlem Renaissance, and Zora Neale Hurston and Elaine Locke, and just so many people, right? Langston Hughes is probably the forerunner there. So much is happening on a lot of different fronts for a lot of different people. And for Asian Americans, the Transcontinental Railroad is completed. And so they're here, moving mostly to the West Coast, San Francisco and Los Angeles. And really, there's a huge blossoming of Asian American cultures. Native Americans are really segregated out on reservations and just decimated in a lot of ways. But we have a lot happening. We have a lot happening in the country in the 1920s. Things seem like they're really progressing for a lot of people in big ways, small ways, but we're like getting somewhere. Then what? 1929, December 7th, 1929. What happens? Yeah, the crash, right? It's just the Great Depression starts. So the crash happens in December of 29 and decimates the country, right? So the really, really rich, the Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk's, Oprah Winfrey's, well, there were no Oprah Winfrey's at the time, but like the really rich, wealthy men, the Carnegies, the Mellons, the Fords, the Morgans, no relation, they're okay. They take hundreds of millions of dollars in loss, but like they have hundreds of millions in excess. It's like Jeff Bezos in Twitter's collapse, that everybody's leaving Twitter. Elon Musk is basically a neo-Nazi, and Tesla's, his cars suck and everybody hates him. So he loses $150 million in 1 week, doesn't even make a dent in his fortune, right? He has billions and billions of dollars. You imagine losing $150 million and like not even blinking. I would lose $10 and I'm looking in every pocket, in every corner, in every room, in the washing machine. I'm like, it's got to be in the washing machine, in the dryer. $150 million done, right? Not a dent. So there's this vast, vast wealth gap between men and women, between whites and blacks, or whites and people of color, right? All people of color, between the haves and the have-nots. There's just this vast wealth gap, economic divide. And the crash, the only sort of upside of the crash is that it levels the playing field a little bit. Because if you're poor, the crash didn't hurt you at all. You didn't have money in the stock market, right? If I don't have all my money in the stock market because I don't have any money, then I don't feel the impacts of that. It was the wealthy, or like the upper class, not the uber wealthy, but the wealthy, that were brought down a peg. So the country gets this middle class that starts being built up. So remember too that the Great Depression happened in 1929, but the worst year of it was actually 1933. So it was 4 or 5 years of meatless Tuesdays, of all of this, right? Like rationing, food rations, clothes. You can't buy new clothes. There's no clothing stores, right? All of that. So I'm going to screen share and give you some images to go through with this. Let me go on my desktop. This bar up top always gets in the way. Okay, so we're going to look at this through images. So, sorry. So just to go back, this says World War II. So what we really want to look at is where we are now. So where is the country all of a sudden in the 1940s? So this is where second wave feminism begins. So here's second wave feminism, and I divide it into 4 parts. So part 1 is 1939. It's when World War II starts. So World War II is 1939 to 1945. And the history of this, obviously, I'm not going to quiz you on the historical. This isn't a class. This isn't one of my history classes, though I always teach like it's history class, but history informs gender, right? Gender changes over the course of history. So there's really no separating the two. But so World War II is really, really, really important for gender studies for two reasons. One, for women in general, because there were women, Black women fighting in World War II, as well as white women. They were just very hidden. But also because it begins an advertising campaign based on gender. So all of a sudden, there's this new market for advertising, for gender to be like a product, for images of women being told who and what to look like in this new era. So it's not first wave feminism, angel in the house, cult of domesticity. It flips the script, and suddenly in World War II, it's women working for the country, for their man, for a purpose, for a larger purpose greater than the home. It's a huge shift. And this starts in World War II. It does not start with Simone de Beauvoir. It does not start with Betty Friedan. It starts here. So I'm going to let you, as I do in the videos, because I talk too much. So I'm going to let you pause and look at some of these and analyze these. But of course, Rosie the Riveter is the number 1 image. She was based on an actual woman, but she becomes, just an icon outside of herself. So here we go, this idea of World War, or first wave feminism rather, woman sewing on the prairie, right? Manifest destiny, all that. And then here she is, sewing, riveting. That's Rosie, right? She's literally riveting. It's a riveter. It's that kind of thing that puts like they're not called nails, but whatever they are, into the airplanes and into tanks and stuff. That's an actual riveter is what that is. So here she is riveting, and it says, it's a tradition with us, mister. So to say, like, we already know how to do this work. It's in our blood to be sort of this domestic laborer. And this kind of goes on and on. So now all of a sudden, the girl he left behind is still behind him. She's a wow. So wows and waves are women. They're all acronyms for like, what was waves? Women. I don't know. Google it. Waves and wow and all these acronyms for women in the military. I'm blanking on waves right now. So the Saturday Evening Post was like Life magazine. You probably don't know that one, but like Time magazine. It was really, really popular. And here's this, this push for women to suddenly be dirty and working and rough. And look at this chick's muscles. This butch queen. It's like where did she come from first wave feminism, right? She just came out of the woodwork. She was always there, right? Rosie was always there, but all of a sudden the United States flips the script on what they need and want women to be. Because why? Because all the men are gone fighting at war, right? So all of a sudden it's like, the government needs women's gender roles to shift in society for an actual economic function, for a purpose. There's this direct capitalist nationalist narrative that is creating gender and womanhood in a new way. Please pause and write that down. That was a good sentence. But then what happens when the men come home? What happens? So now this is for real. What happens if you're a woman? So pretend that you're a 1940s, it's 1943, you're a woman, you were just the angel in the house and stuck at home and like birthing babies after baby after babies. Your man goes to war in World War II, and what happens to you? You have to go get a job. The government tells you, go be a wave and a wow, and all of these. That's going to drive me nuts. Wait, hold on. Okay, I had to Google it. Waves. It was driving me nuts that I couldn't remember what that. I like just blanked on it. It's women accepted for voluntary emergency services. So WAVES is a voluntary corps of like American nurses. And it's, just racist and problematic and classist and it's all sorts of things. But WAVES is this really famous women in the military. Okay. Specifically World War II. So let me go back to my screen. It was just driving me bananas. I couldn't deal. All right. So here we were in narrative. All right. So you're Rosie the Riveter. It's 1942. You go to work. You're in the voluntary corps service. You're working for the military. You're riveting. What's your life like, right? Just sit and sort of take it in. What is your life as a woman working for the first time? You're not an angel. You're Rosie. You are Rosie, like muscle Rosie. You have a job. What does that mean? You have a bank, you have money. You have money that's your own money. For the first time, you work a day, you get paid for the first time ever. You're working, you're getting paid. You get to open a bank account. You get to save your money. What also is happening? What also happens? Again, pretend that you're like this straight woman, Rosie. What happens? What happens that your man's gone? You're not having sex, right? And like probably having sex with each other, right? Like all these women are probably sleeping with each other, but that's beside the point. You're not having intercourse with a man. What does that mean? You're not getting pregnant, right? It's like one of the great benefits of lesbianism. You have to choose motherhood so clearly, right? Lesbian joke, right? There's no accidental pregnancies, right? So your man's away, probably having the best sex of your life. Right? You're also not getting pregnant every time you have sex, right? So what does that mean? It means you're your own woman, right? You're not saddled down with a bunch of kids. So where does all your money go? In your pocket, right? Don't get me wrong, I love my children, but like all my money goes to them, all my time, my body goes to them, everything goes to them, right? You're pregnant for almost a year, you're breastfeeding for a year, 2 years, right? Right? All the moms are going to know what I'm saying. It's not comparable to fatherhood. Right? Okay, so Rosie the Riveter, you've got money, you've got a job. What also psychologically comes with that? What comes with not having kids? Your hormones are balanced, right? There's so much physicality that changes your mentality when you have kids, right? So you're free from all of that. You're free from all the pregnancy hormones. You're free from the estrogen and progesterone gains and losses and, right? No postpartum depression, all of the physical things that come along with that. Your bodily autonomy impacts your psychology, right? Impacts literally biologically your estrogen, all of the things, yeah? But also psychologically, you are your own person. You're not answering to a man. You're not answering to your dad, to your brothers, to your husband, right? The patriarchy is not dictating what you wear, where you go, what you dress like. Nothing. No one's around. It's just these big communities of women living in barracks, going to work, coming home to their house, to the army barracks, to each other, right? Just think of I'm giving you a third of all of the consequences of what that means. A third, right? I'm telling you economically, physically, psychologically. There are way more, right? Way more. Keep digging in there. Then the men come home. 1945, the war ends. Hundreds of thousands of men have died. Yours comes home. What happens? You're glad, you're grateful, your man's home. That's a godsend. But what happens? What like logistically happens? Like pause the video, brainstorm out a few things. What happens? You get fired, right? First and foremost, you get fired. He wants his job back. It's suddenly not girl work anymore, right? It's not woman's work anymore. Yeah. You get fired. You get put back in the kitchen. This is the era, the 1950s, is where the phrase barefoot and pregnant comes from. And this is where we get the baby boom. So my parents, your grandparents, are the baby boom generation. Why? Because the men came home and everybody had sex the same day. Everybody had a ton of sex, like all in the same month, right? In the same like 3-month span of when all the enlisted men were coming back, if they were lucky enough to come back. They all had sex. All the women got pregnant. Like people who were infertile got pregnant. Like everybody got pregnant. So this is the baby boom generation, right? All the folks born in the 50s. My mom, may she rest, was 56. It's just, this is the generation, right? This is all the people at the top tier in our society now. They're in their 60s and 70s. They have all the VP jobs, the president jobs, like they're up, right? Well, Sleepy Joe is 100, but the VP jobs, the presidents of company jobs, right? So this is what happens to these women. And now we're getting to Betty Friedan and like Simone de Beauvoir. So here's, I guess she's in the late 40s, but so we go from Rosie the Riveter to the 50s and 60s. So this is part 2. Rosie, Leave It to Beaver. So all of a sudden, literally this butch queen right here becomes this chick. It's when Barbie was invented, right? Disney movies start like pushing this idealized princessy crap down our throats. And here we go. Women don't leave the kitchen, and like literally they're in heels, right? Look at every single one of these women in heels, hair done, makeup on, right? In the button-up dress, the tight clothes, big boobs, little waist, right? The roundy skirts. Look at these ads. We all know a woman's place is in the home, cooking a man a delicious meal. But if you are still enjoying the bachelor's life and don't have a little miss waiting on you, then come down to Hardee's for something sloppy and hastily prepared. Hardee's was a restaurant like Arby's, like Roy Rogers. You guys don't know any of these. It was like McDonald's, but like a sit-down restaurant, like Denny's or IHOP. It's like that. So even there, a restaurant trying to get customers is telling you should be married in a cis-het way to a woman and have your 2.5 kids, right? So they're trying to even get customers, and they're losing it. So the 40s and 50s advertising pushes this cisgender heteronormative experience that is not only oppressive for women, right? Don't worry, darling, at least you didn't burn the beer, right? It also becomes this way for men. So men in this cis het normativity also have to then become violent, domineering, aggressive. They have to be the head of the household. That phrase is really problematic, right? All the things. So women are going to work, but the only way that they can go to work is as secretaries, who are, oftentimes sexually assaulted and abused and harassed by their bosses, right? Think of the show Mad Men. They're also being abused at home. If your husband ever finds out you're not testing your coffee, like violence is these are real ads. This is not This is not made up. So the same doubled down, though, for Black women. So we either have sort of this debutante, middle-class African-American families, which we definitely had a lot of in Philadelphia, Germantown families. Before gentrification, there were a lot of wealthy Black families here. But we also have this sort of glorification and fetishization of Black women as domestic labor. And I hate this movie, The Help, but I mean, it's got a lot of funny and like heartwarming parts, don't get me wrong, but it again just pushes this narrative of Black women's domestication, and it's highly problematic. It also connects to what people in critical theory and African American studies call slave porn, that the only way African Americans are ever depicted, especially Black women, is as either slaves being raped or as domestic labor being punished in sort of, punitively treated by white women. So it shows, it like never shows Black women's autonomy. It never shows their, not that they had a lot of it, but it never shows any kind of, other versions of Blackness. And it's violent. It's just a lot. That's why Hidden Figures and Black Panther and these other narratives around Blackness are so important, where like race and gender. So watch this at your leisure. So the #1 TV show was Leave It to Beaver. And this is a clip from Leave It to Beaver. And it just really exemplifies this idea of like, women are back in the home, in the private sphere, and men are back out in the public sphere. Women lose all their autonomy. And what happens because of that, right? Like really what happens? Let me just pause here for a second. Sorry about that. There was a typo. Okay, so the thing about the 1950s and 1960s that really concretizes, that really cements womanhood in this barefoot and pregnant, be in the house, stay at home, not angel in the house, but with some autonomy, is consumerism. So consumerism becomes the #1 thing that solidifies that a woman's place is in the home. So you'll remember in the first wave feminism, we had, sorry, let me just get back to where I want to be. In first wave feminism, we had this like hysteria, right? Well, in the 1950s and second wave feminism, it becomes neuroses. So when you read Betty Friedan and Simone de Beauvoir, this is where you're going to get this conception of woman as capital O, other. And what makes her an other is that she externally is, fitting this mold, but internally she is just breaking apart and breaking down, and she becomes neurotic. It's called housewife fatigue. So advertising and consumption has a lot to do with this. In first wave, again, we were just getting electricity and just getting indoor plumbing. A lot of people didn't have any of that stuff for a very long time. In second wave, when the men come home from war and World War I's over, World War II's over, we don't have World War III yet, fingers crossed. We have to put all of our time and energy and equipment and technology. We have all this tank building equipment. We have all this airplane building equipment. It gets put to use in consumerism. And there's refrigeration, there's washers and dryers. There's toaster ovens, there's television. Everybody's got every family's got a car now. So picture the 1950s as this period where there's just mass consumption. So the men come home from the war, they've all got these great jobs. Well, not all of them. This is obviously, there's racism here, out the teeth, right? But there's a lot of jobs to be had, and there's a lot of money to be spent. We came out pretty good on top of the wars, where Germany was decimated, London was bombed, France was bombed, like so many European countries, which is where the wars were fought, were just bombed all to hell. But the United States was all the way across the Atlantic. We didn't get touched. Yes, of course, we lost lives, but like our country wasn't bombed all to hell. So we were booming technologically, right? So there's this mass wave, vacuum cleaners. Oh my God, we just had everything that we take for granted today was invented and sold in the 1950s. So here's the images for that. And you can see not only is it very gender role specific, wives, right? But that gender role is solidified through consumption of material goods. So the way to be a woman here is to be a good mother, to be a good worker, to be a good friend, Tupperware, right? Like all these things were invented now, to be a good hostess. But there's one neglect. This product, believe it or not, is for a Lysol douche. Don't even ask. It's horrifying. I don't even know how many people were like killed and right. So the downside to the 1950s is that it was incredibly oppressive. Women were getting back alley abortions. They were using Lysol as a douche. Nobody should douche anything ever. There were virulent racism. Remember that we're in Jim Crow South. We're also in Jim Crow North, and we had our own versions of that in the North. There were white water fountains, colored water fountains, right? It was the 1950s were a time of vast sexism, vast, horrifying, violent lynchings, mass murders. Think Emmett Till, right? Black people being murdered with not one white person going to jail, not one white person being convicted. So the 1950s had, when people talk about the good old days, it has this veneer, right, of calm because we weren't in a world war. It has this veneer of like, everybody has a house and a car and a vacuum and a refrigerator and indoor plumbing. But that's not accurate, right? That's not even remotely accurate. But that's what advertising has us believe. The problem then becomes this. So what's really happening behind the scenes is racism, sexism, homophobia. Nobody was out of the closet. If there was just like these beatnik circles where people were out of the closet, like Allen Ginsberg, they were absolutely segregated to these tiny little plots in West Village in New York City, that kind of thing. Okay. So really, really problematic, oppressive time. 1950s. Okay. Just watch one episode, the first episode of Mad Men, and you will get it all. All right, so what happens after the 1950s and the 1960s? So this is up until like 63, 64, 65. What happens? What happens to shift the culture into what we know as the 60s and 70s? We know in the 70s, you've got the Black Panthers, you've got the American Indian movement, Native Americans took over Alcatraz prison for months, like took it over from the government. Just took it over. There were people, Asian Americans were breaking into buildings and taking them over. There were sit-ins, there were teach-ins, there were huge protests. Muhammad Ali is burning his draft card. Just how do we get from this chick to this chick? Right? Like, how does that happen? Well, one of the things, and what you'll read about in Friedan right here in the 60s, is women's suicide rates, women's over-medicating, taking vast amounts of pills. If you watch any movie like The Hours, you will see this discrepancy between the outside veneer of what's happening and the internal lived experience of women of the time. So what ends up happening in the 60s once women have this, what they neuroses, again, you'll read about this in Friedan, and so I'm not going to go too far into it, but the housewife fatigue that ends up happening, this depression and these vast amounts of suicides that were happening from these, perfect housewives, a lot of women started saying, excuse my language, but fuck this. I am exhausted. I hate my husband. My children suck, like everything. And I'm done. I'm not going to throw myself on the sword of society's version of womanhood. So I'm going to go practice free love. I'm going to get a divorce. I'm going to go get a real job. So this second or fourth part of second wave is when white women start getting PhDs, the first MDs, the first JDs, lawyers. White women who have money and access to education and sort of have been allowed to enter these spaces, they start getting really educated. They start really taking over. This is where we have people like Gloria Steinem, these really famous advocate white women, feminist, second wave, but like at the end, right, there was no fighters. I mean, there were tons of fighters, but there was no public figure like Gloria Steinem before then, Betty Friedan, really. And the problem, of course, is that these white women who were fighting for women's liberation, completely disregarded Black women's experience. So Black women, while there were obviously some Black women in women's liberation, Black women ended up, like Angela Davis, going to the Black Power movement. So here's the thing. You can watch Angela Davis's interview, and please go down the rabbit hole of YouTube videos of Angela Davis speeches. Brilliant. And Gloria Steinem, like the two of them together are amazing, and a million other women who are amazing at the time. Here's the thing. So, and I'm going to focus on Black women in particular here, because this is like a real specific moment. But Asian Americans are having their moment too. Remember, Vincent Chin was murdered by white folks for being Asian and like taking American jobs. And so if you don't know who Vincent Chin is, please Google Vincent Chin. Asian Americans were absolutely having their own radical moments and protests, and that never gets talked about. But right at this moment, I want to talk about women's liberation of the second wave, the end of the second wave. So if you're a Black woman in second wave feminism and you try to enter white women's sphere, what has become the white female sphere of like academia, the ivory tower, you want a PhD, you want to write books, you want to be a speaker. And the white women said, let's just fight for women's rights. I don't really want to deal with Blackness, right? That's what they said. Not Gloria Steinem, she was a good egg, but a lot of women. So white women fought for their jobs and their PhDs and were like fighting against so much patriarchy that they were just so self-centered and really just elbowing their way through all these men, white men, who were like underqualified, didn't have PhDs, like just had these jobs, that they got really self-centered and they got really selfish about wanting their place at the table and their power. And we can get it, right? We can get that white women have never had this power in this way. They were fighting for it. However, the caveat to that is that they literally left behind Black women. They bailed hard on sisterhood. And I'll be honest with you, white and Black women have never recovered. As a white woman in academia, I will tell you that there is still this like uncomfortability in academia between Black women and white women. It's hard because there's still not this sense of like shared space and we're in this together. And like women's liberation means, like Audre Lorde says, if there's any woman in oppression, I'm oppressed. Like this is a sisterhood, right? So Black women were like, fuck you, white women with your pulls up your butts and your like PhDs. You suck. You're not living up to sisterhood. You're not living up to women's liberation. You're not living up to any of thing that you're talking about. You're really just fighting for power for yourself. This also happened with the Trump vote, right? White women chose to vote with white men, and Donald Trump, who was being accused of 26 counts of rape, they chose Trump, right? White women got Trump in office. They chose Trump and like white power over the 98% of Black women that voted for like Hillary Clinton, right? No, it was like 89% of Black women who voted for Hillary Clinton, or not Trump, I should say, not for Hillary, but like voted not for Trump, right? So white women still aren't choosing women, right? They're still not choosing, they would still choose a white male rapist over another woman, right? There's still that mentality. White women have a long way to go, right? So Black women said, all right, well, forget you. I'm going to go to Blackness then. If I'm not going to choose my gender, I'm going to choose my race. But what happens as a Black woman, I then choose my race and I go join the Black Panthers. How are the Panthers treating me? Right? Because then it's patriarchy. It's not racism, it's sexism. So Black women now are like fetching the coffee of the Black Panthers, right? So now Huey Long is like, get my coffee, sister, right? So Black women are in this untenable position. They're trapped between a rock and a hard place. At no point is anyone letting them be the intersectional space of Black women. So then we get the Combahee River Collective. And this is the bridge. It's also a book called The Bridge Called My Back. This bridge called my back. So Black women in the Combahee River Collective and this bridge called my back, these two, one's a manifesto and one's a book, but they're both representative of a Black women's movement. And a lot of them are like queer, lesbian, socialist Black women. They're all so rad. And they are saying, I'm going to sit over here in my intersectionality and I'm going to write my writings and I'm going to speak what I need to say. And we're going to write this collective statement. And that's this sort of segue from second wave into third wave, because Combahee River Collective of Black, a lot of them are queer women, said, we're going to push for what we need because no space is allowing us to exist, right? So in the 70s, there's this white women's free love, hippie, lesbian thing happening. There's a queer movement happening and Stonewall riots happen, in 77. There's like all this stuff in the queer movement, we'll get there, happening. Then there's this Black women's and Black queer movement happening, Black women's queer movement happening. There's also a Black male queer movement, like think James Baldwin, right? Like Google any speech by James Baldwin. It will change your life. It will change your life. James Baldwin will change your life. All of these movements are happening. So we're going to end on this note. We can see the benefit, right? We can see the beauty and the strength and the power in all of these movements. What's the downside? Is there a downside? What's the downside? What's the downside? So this is the question I'm going to leave you on. I want you to think about it and I want you to figure it out. What's the downside to all of these powerful movements happening? There's a lot of good. There's a lot of good. What might be an unintended, negative, problematic consequence or like fallout to having all these movements? Okay. All right. Second wave feminism in 4 parts. in probably what will be my longest video ever. That's just a lot of information. Thank you so much for watching. I'm really proud of you. You got through it. Go take a break. Binge White Lotus. Binge Insecure. Go take a break. Bye, everybody.